city where the girls are so pretty. 'Twas there that I first met sweet Molly Malone. As she wheeled her wheelbarrow through streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh.
I do not think that any writer has yet presented Dublin to the world. It has been a capital of Europe for thousands of years. It is supposed to be the second city of the British Empire, and it is nearly 3 times as big as Venice.
With these words, James Joyce, the Irish writer, presented his hometown Dublin to a publisher in 1904. Joyce is the author of Stephen Hero, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Ulysses, and Finnegan's Wake. The small world to which James Joyce belonged physically until 1904, and imaginatively all his life, was that of Dublin, and all his works were about Dublin. Joyce said,
"If the physical city of Dublin was totally destroyed, it could be rebuilt in detail if my works were referred to."
Joyce's Dublin has almost disappeared, but the cityscape which he recreated in his work has such a strong vitality that it imposes itself on the imagination in its own special way. The types he created in his book still walk the city streets. The moral dimensions of his art are still valid. The writer Peter Costello said,
When James Joyce died in Zurich in January 1941, he left behind an enduring literary legend. His life in exile, poverty and pain had become common knowledge. His books, though largely unread, were notorious for their veiled obscurity and supposed obscenity. But Joyce was more than just obscene. He was known to be difficult. His frankness served a literary ideal derived from the philosophies of Aristotle and Aquinas. Behind the supposed pornographer of popular legend lurks the complex mind of an Irish Catholic.
James Augustine Joyce was born in this house at 41 Brighton Square, Dublin, on the 2nd of February 1882. Brighton Square, a Victorian suburb, was a quiet residential area of eminent respectability. Joyce's father, John Stanislaus. John Joyce, a well-educated and jovial man, was a rate collector. Joyce's mother, May Mary Joyce. May Joyce, who was 10 years younger than her husband, was a kindly, gentle woman, and her son was very attached to her. Joyce's family was then part of the influential elite in Dublin, and they had a wide circle of friends. As John Stanislaus was very impressed by James, he decided to send him to the very influential Jesuit college, Clongowes Wood, reputed to be the best Catholic preparatory school in Ireland. James was then a well-behaved, pale-faced boy with pale blue eyes. His cool, serene disposition prompted his parents to call him Sonny Jim. When Joyce was being enrolled at Clongowes Wood, the rector, Father Conmee, asked the boy his age. Joyce, who was then 6.5, said, 6:30. At Clongowes Wood, he was top of his class and also won trophies for hurdling and walking.
The evening air was pale and chilly, and after every charge and thud of the footballers, the greasy leather orb flew like a heavy bird through the grey light.
At Clongowes Wood, Joyce became very pious. He even wrote a hymn to the Blessed Virgin Mary. His prayers and fantasies were filled with death and incantations against it. Martello Terrace, where the Joyce family lived from 1887 to 1892. As the young James listened to the loud political discussions at home, he realised that Parnell was a hero. Joyce wrote a poem about the betrayal of Parnell. His father was so proud that he had the poem printed in a limited edition. In the Dubliner story Ivy Day, Joyce wrote,
He fell as fall the mighty ones, nobly undaunted to the last, and death has now united him with Erin's heroes of the past.
After the Parnell affair, there was a change in Irish politics and John Joyce lost his job. His wife petitioned the authorities, and her husband was granted a pension of £32 a year. He was then only 42 and never worked again. James was removed from the expensive Clongowes Wood College. One day when Joyce's father was strolling around Mountjoy Square, he met Father Conmee, rector of Clongowes Wood. He immediately arranged that James and his brother Stanislaus could enter the Jesuit school, Belvedere College. At the end of 1894, the Joyce family moved to a slightly better neighbourhood at 17 North Richmond Street near Mountjoy Square, and later he used them in his stories. Joyce also developed characters from his school companions.
It was Joe Dillon who introduced the Wild West to us. He and his fat young brother, Leo the Idler, held the loft of the stable while we tried to carry it by storm. But however well we fought, we never won siege or battle, and all our bouts ended with Joe Dillon's war dance of victory. He looked like some kind of an Indian when he capered around the garden, an old tea cosy on his head, beating a tin with his fist and yelling, "Ya, yakka, yakka, yakka." Everyone was incredulous when it was reported that he had a vocation for the priesthood. Nevertheless, it was true.
Joyce's brother Stanislaus told the story of how, when Joyce was 13, they played truant, mitching the Irish call it. The brothers planned to walk to the Pigeon House in Dublin Bay.
That night I slept badly. In the morning I was first comer to the bridge, as I lived nearest. All the branches of the tall trees which lined the mall were gay with little green leaves, and the sunlight slanted through them onto the water. The granite stone of the bridge was beginning to be warm, and I began to pat it with my hands in time to the air in my head. I was very happy.
The view from North Strand Bridge and the Royal Canal. Mahony came, but Dillon doesn't turn up.
"Come along, on you fatty funkit," said Mahony.
The boys walked along the North Strand Road and then along Wharf Road and continued southwards until they reached the quays.
We pleased ourselves with the spectacle of Dublin's commerce. The barges signalled from far away by their curls of woolly smoke, the brown fishing fleet beyond Ring's End. Mahony said it'd be a right skit to run away to sea on one of those big ships, and even I, looking at the high masts, saw or imagined the geography which had been scantily dosed to me at school gradually taking substance under my eyes.
The boys crossed the Liffey in a ferry boat. They were disappointed that none of the Norwegian sailors unloading a ship on the opposite quay had green eyes. By the time they got to Ring's End, they were tired, so they went back to the Dodder River and sat around for a while. While the boys were resting, they met a strange old man. He talked about young girls and also about whipping, which upset them. Then, as it was getting late, they gave up the idea of going to the Pigeon House. Joyce was an excellent student at Belvedere College. One night, Joyce was on his way home. He was enticed into a dark corner by a prostitute and had his first sexual experience. But after repenting and going to confession, he again sought the company of girls.
He wanted to sin with another of his kind, to force another being to sin with him, and to exult with her in sin.
Despite these and other incidents, the Jesuits were impressed by young Joyce and suggested that he might join the order. In a portrait, Joyce wrote,
"How often had he seen himself as a priest wielding calmly and humbly the awful power of which angels and saints stood in reverence. His soul had loved to muse in secret on this desire."
The young Joyce was fascinated by the history and the suggestive power of words, and most of the characters in his books, with whom he unmistakably identifies, share the same preoccupations. In Stephen Hero, Stephen walks through Dublin.
As he walked thus through the ways of the city, he had his ears and eyes ever prompt to receive impressions. It was not only in Skeet that he found words for the treasure house. He found them also at haphazard, in the shops, on advertisements. He kept repeating them to himself till they lost all instantaneous meaning for him and became wonderful vocables.
Joyce always carried a small notebook in which he wrote down what he called epiphanies, snatches of conversation and small incidents.
The young lady, softly, Oh, but you're very wicked.
In another episode of The Portrait of the Artist, Stephen is walking near the sea at the Bull Wall.
He drew forth a phrase from his treasure and spoke it softly to himself. A day of dappled seaborne clouds. The phrase and the day and the scene harmonized in accord. Words. Was it their colors? He allowed them to glow and fade, hue after hue. Sunrise gold, the russet and green of apple orchards, azure of waves, the grey-fringed fleece of clouds. No, it was not their colors. It was the poise and balance of the period itself. Did he then love the rhythmic rise and fall of words better than their associations of legend and color? A veiled sunlight lit up faintly the grey sheet of water where the river was embayed. In the distance, along the course of the sun-flowing Liffey, slender masts flecked the sky, and more distant still, the dim fabric of the city lay prone in haze. There was a long rivulet in the Strand, and, as he waded slowly up its course, he wondered at the endless drift of seaweed. Emerald and black and russet and olive, it moved beneath the current, swaying and turning. The water of the rivulet was dark with endless drift and mirrored the high drifting clouds. The clouds were drifting above him silently, and silently the sea tangle was drifting below him, and the grey warm air was still, and a new wild life was singing in his veins. A girl stood before him, alone and still, gazing out to sea. She seemed like one whom magic had changed into the likeness of a strange and beautiful seabird. Her image had passed into his soul forever, and no word had broken the holy silence of his ecstasy. He felt above him the vast, indifferent dome and the calm processes of the heavenly bodies, and the earth beneath him, the earth that had borne him, had taken him to her breast. He closed his eyes in the languor of sleep. His eyelids trembled as if they felt the vast cyclic movement of the earth, and her watchers trembled as if they felt the strange light of some new world. His soul was swooning into some new world, fantastic, dim, uncertain as under sea, traversed by cloudy shapes and beings. A world, a glimmer, or a flower? Wave of light by wave of light, flooding all the heavens with its soft flushes, every flush deeper than another.
Joyce left Belvedere College in 1898 when he was 16. His father allowed him to enter University College Dublin. Joyce kept up with his own particular preoccupations, the great writers, Flaubert, Ibsen, Dante and D'Annunzio. He learnt Norwegian so as to read Ibsen in the original. He wrote articles of praise on Ibsen, some of which were published in the Fortnightly Review. Joyce was then 18, and the articles not only brought him a certain notoriety, but very important for his family, a large cheque of 12 guineas. His father began to have serious financial problems. Joyce always spent a lot of time with his brother Stanislaus, who was an intelligent and critical companion, and a good storyteller. Stanislaus gave Joyce many tidbits of Dublin life, which Joyce later included in stories, especially in Dubliners.
They walked along Nassau Street and then turned into Kildare Street. Not far from the porch of a club, a harpist stood in the roadway, playing to a little ring of listeners. One hand played in the bass the melody of Silent O'Moyle, while the other hand careered in a treble after each group of notes. The notes of the air sounded deep and full.
Joyce's mother died in August 1903 at the age of 44. Shortly before she died, Joyce sang at her bedside Yeats's Who's Gone with Fergus, but he refused a blunt order from a relative to kneel in prayer beside his mother's bedside. However, his mother was already in a coma. After his mother's death, which affected him badly, Joyce seemingly did nothing else but hang around the streets of Dublin. In fact, he wrote book reviews for the Irish edition of the Daily Express. Now at last, even if the money paid for his articles was small, he was a professional writer. He spent a lot of time just reading and writing at the National Library. Joyce had a fine tenor voice and decided to try for a singing career. He was encouraged in this by the man who was to become a world-famous singer himself, John McCormick. Joyce took singing lessons and then entered for the important Feshcole music competition in Dublin. When the judges asked him to read some music on sight, he refused even to try. Nevertheless, he was awarded a second-class bronze medal. This failure decided him to continue with his literary career. Joyce left home and for a while took a room in a boarding house. At this time he began to spend much of his time carousing with his friend Oliver Gogarty. They went for long walks around the town looking for girls. In the story The Boarding House, Joyce showed a special interest in girls.
Polly was a slim girl of 19. She had light, soft hair. Her eyes, which were grey with a shade of green through them, had a habit of glancing upwards when she spoke with anyone, which made her look like a little perverse Madonna.
On the 10th of June 1904, an event of great importance happened to Joyce. He was walking down Nassau Street, Dublin, when he noticed a tall, auburn-haired young woman striding proudly along. When Joyce spoke to her, she answered in such a way that he continued talking. As Joyce had a yachting cap and blue eyes, she thought that he was a Swedish sailor. Joyce found out that she was a chambermaid at Finn's Hotel, a better-class boarding house. With a lilting accent, she told him that she was from Galway. Her name was a bit funny, Barnacle, Nora Barnacle. They talked for a while, and Nora agreed to meet Joyce on the 14th of June in front of the Oscar Wilde family house at Merrion Square. But Nora Barnacle did not come, and Joyce sent her this melancholy note.
I may be blind. I looked for a long time at a head of reddish brown hair and decided it was not yours. I went home quite dejected. I would like to make an appointment, but it might not suit you. I hope you will be kind enough to make one with me if you have not forgotten me.
Nora made another appointment for June the 16th, and they spent the evening walking at Ringsend. Joyce immortalised this date of the 16th of June 1904 when he wrote Ulysses. All the episodes of Ulysses take place on that day. This was a very significant and eloquent way of paying tribute to Nora. It was also a recognition of the important role of Nora in Joyce's life. On the 16th of June 1904, Joyce left behind him the isolation and solitude he had felt since the death of his mother. Later he told Nora,
On that day you made me a man.
Joyce felt increasingly frustrated by his life in Dublin. With the death of his mother, there was nothing to hold him there any longer. He felt that in order to create, he needed freedom, not only from the restrictions that Ireland imposed on its writers, but also so that he could be detached from his subject, Dublin. But he now needed Nora. When Joyce asked her to go away with him, Nora, who by now was in love with this pretentious intellectual she didn't fully understand, accepted with enthusiasm. Joyce and Nora left Dublin discreetly on the 8th of October 1904. Joyce spent 36 years in voluntary exile until his death at the age of 58. Despite their haphazard existence, Nora never left Joyce. They had 2 children, a son Giorgio and a daughter Lucia. Much of Joyce's literary work was done when he was working as an English teacher in Pola, Trieste and Zurich. In Paris, Joyce was encouraged and helped financially by friends and writers. Amongst these were Eugène Jolas, Paul Léon and Valérie Larbaud. Ulysses was written between 1914 and 1922. After much difficulty, the novel was first published in Paris in a limited edition of 1,000 copies by Sylvia Beach. Joyce received the first copy for his 40th birthday on the Ulysses for obscenity. When Sylvia Beach sent part of a second edition to the United States, the books were confiscated and later burned. In England, the custom authorities also confiscated the book. Many leading writers and personalities, including Ezra Pound, Ford Madox Ford, and John Quinn, intervened to help the publication of Ulysses, which they considered a very important work. Finally, in 1933, the American Judge Woolsey gave a court ruling that Ulysses was not a pornographic work, and the novel was published in America and became a bestseller. Ulysses was published in England in 1936. One day, while talking to a friend, George Borac, Joyce confessed that his favourite hero was Homer's Ulysses.
I was 12 years old when we dealt with the Trojan War at school. Only the Odyssey stuck in my memory. I want to be candid. At 12, I liked the mysticism in Ulysses. In Rome, when I had finished about half of the portrait, I realized that the Odyssey had to be the sequel, and I began to write Ulysses.
Ulysses is a chronicle of occurrences in Dublin on the 16th of June 1904. Certain events seem to be related to real episodes of Joyce's own life. The first chapter of Ulysses, entitled Telemachus, deals with the activity of early morning and the thoughts that pass through the mind of Stephen Dedalus as he and his friends Buck Mulligan and Haines prepare for the day. The action begins in the Martello Tower at Sandy Cove, overlooking Dublin Bay. The Martello Tower is a late 18th century fortification erected to help frustrate an Irish rebellion during the Napoleonic Wars. This tower has become to readers all over the world a Joycean symbol, the physical starting point of an Odyssey which has changed the history of modern literature. The day begins with a parody of the Mass. Ulysses begins with these lines.
Stately, plump Buck Mulligan came from the stairhead, bearing a bowl of lather on which a mirror and a razor lay crossed. He held the bowl aloft and intoned, Intruibo ad altare Dei. Halted, he peered down the dark, winding stairs and called up coarsely, Come up, Kinch! Come up, you fearful Jesuit!
Kinch, Stephen, reluctantly goes up to the top of the tower.
Lend us a loan of your nose rag to wipe a razor. Stephen suffered him to pull out and hold up on show by its corner a dirty, crumpled handkerchief. The bard's nose rag. A new art colour for our Irish poets. Snot green. You can almost taste it, can't you? God, he said quietly, isn't the sea what Algy calls it? A great sweet mother. The snot green sea. The scrotum tightening sea. Epi oinepa ponton. Ah, Daedalus, the Greeks. I must teach you. You must read them in the original. Talata, talata. She is our great sweet mother. Our mighty mother, Buck Mulligan said. The aunt thinks you killed your mother, he said. That's why she won't let me have anything to do with you. Someone killed her, Stephen said gloomily. Stephen stood at his post, gazing over the calm sea towards the headland. Sea and headland now grew dim. Pulses were beating in his eyes, veiling their sight as he felt the fever of his cheeks. A voice within the tower called loudly, Are you up there, Mulligan? I'm coming, Buck Mulligan answered. He turned towards Stephen and said, Look at the sea. What does it care about offences? Chuck Loyola Kinch and come on down. The Sassenach wants his morning rashers. Don't mope over it all day, he said. I'm inconsequent. Give up the moody brooding. His head vanished, but the drone of his descending voice boomed out of the stairhead. And no more turn aside and brood, for Fergus rules the brazen cars. Wood shadows floated silently by through the morning peace from the stairhead, seaward where he gazed. Inshore and farther out, the mirror of water whitened, spurned by light-shod, hurrying feet. White breast of the dim sea, the twining stresses, 2 by 2. A hand plucking the harp strings, merging their twining chords. Wave-white, wedded words shimmering on the dim tide. A cloud began to cover the sun slowly, shadowing the bay in deeper green. It lay behind him, a bowl of bitter waters. Fergus's song. I sang it alone in the house, holding down the long, dark chords. Her door was open. She wanted to hear my music. Silent with awe and pity, I went to her bedside. She was crying in her wretched bed. Love's bitter mystery. Where now?
In this sequence, Joyce begins to accustom us to his prose style, which changes in tone, colour and direction as suddenly as his character's thoughts. Unfinished sentences and random words. In the second chapter of Ulysses, Nestor, Stephen is at work teaching history and poetry at a small private school. He also talks to the headmaster, Mr. Deasy, who gives him his pay and a letter to bring to a newspaper. At 10 o'clock, when the boys go off to play, Stephen goes for a walk. In the third chapter, Parodies, Stephen is walking on the mud flats of Sandyman Strand, about 9 miles from the Martello Tower. He thinks about the fundamental questions of life and the universe. While walking along the Strand, he considers the visual mode of experience, the colours and forms he observes.
Ineluctable modality of the visible. At least that, if no more, thought through my eyes. Signatures of all things I am here to read. Sea spawn and sea wrack. The nearing tide, that rusty boot. Snot green, blue silver, rust. Coloured signs. Limits of the diaphan. But, he adds, in bodies. Then he was aware of them bodies before of them coloured. How? By knocking his sconce against them, sure.
Stephen closes his eyes to find out what he experienced when the visual mode is excluded. As he continues to walk, the mode of his experience shifts to the oral.
Stephen closed his eyes to hear his boots crush crackling rack and shells. You are walking through it, howsomever. I am, a stride at a time. A very short space of time, through very short times of space. 5, 6, the Nakainander. Exactly. And that is the ineluctable modality of the audible. Open your eyes. No, Jesus! If I fell through the Nebeneinander, ineluctably.
Stephen taps with a stick and notes how in the darkness his sense of hearing is accentuated.
I am getting on nicely in the dark. My ash sword hangs at my side. Tap with it. They do. Sounds solid. Open your eyes now. I will. One moment. Has all vanished since? See now. There, all the time without you, and forever shall be, world without end.
There's a contrast between those scenes in Ulysses, which are seen through Stephen's eyes, and those in which another narrator tells a story. Using the stream of consciousness technique, Joyce makes a deliberate distinction between the inner view we have of ourselves and the appearance we have for others. In the fourth part of Ulysses, Calypso, Mr. Leopold Bloom, Odysseus, is introduced. He lives at 7 Eccles Street and is described as a Jew who on this day of the 16th of June 1904 is 38 years old. Mr. Bloom works as a newspaper advertising agent. He is married to Molly, an attractive singer who is having an affair with her manager, Blazes Boylan.
Mr. Leopold Bloom ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls. Most of all, he liked grilled mutton kidneys, which gave to his palate a fine tang of faintly scented urine. He turned from the tray, lifted the kettle off the hob, and set it sideways on the fire. Cup of tea soon? Good. Mouth dry. The cat walked stiffly round a leg of the table with tail on high. Meow. Oh, there you are, Mr. Bloom said, turning from the fire. The cat mewed in answer and stalked again stiffly round a leg of the table, mewing. Just how she stalks over my writing table. Brrr, scratched my head. Milk for the pussins? He said. Meow. He said softly in the bare hall, I'm going round the corner. Be back in a minute. On the doorstep, he felt in his hip pocket for the latchkey. Not there? In the trousers I left off. Potato I have. He crossed to the bright side, avoiding the loose cellar flap of number 75. The sun was nearing the steeple of George's church. Be a warm day, I fancy. Especially in these black clothes, feel it more. His eyelids sank quietly often as he walked in happy warmth.
The American writer Marvin Magdalena said, the selection of a Jew as the central character of Mr. Bloom has been attributed to the important role Jews have played in modern culture, to Joyce's own acquaintances, to the parallel of Jew and Irishmen as men whose land have been usurped, to Jewish shrewdness as a symbol of modern commerce, or to Joyce's own opposition to anti-Semitism. As Mr. Bloom walks along, he has a spell of daydreaming and gets lost in reverie.
Makes you feel young. Somewhere in the east, early morning. Set off at dawn, travel round in front of the sun, steal a day's march in him. Keep it up forever, never grow a day older, technically. Walk along a strand. Strange land. Come to a city gate, sentry there, old ranker too. Old Tweedy's big moustaches leaning on a long kind of a spear. Wander through awned streets. Turbaned faces going by. Dark caves of carpet chops. Big man, Turco the Terrible, seated cross-legged smoking a coiled pipe. Cries of sellers in the streets. Drink water scented with fennel, sherbet. Wander along all day. Might meet a robber or two. Well, meet him. Getting on to sundown. The shadows of the mosque along the pillars. Priest with a scroll rolled up. A shiver of the trees signal the evening wind. I pass on. Fading gold sky. A mother watches from her doorway. She calls our children home in their dark language. High wall. Beyond strings twanged. Night sky moon. Violet. Colour of Molly's new garters. Strings, listen. A girl playing one of these instruments, what do you call them? Dulcimers. I pass. Probably not a bit like it, really. Kind of stuff you read. In the Track of the Sun. Sunburst on the title page. He smiled, pleasing himself. He approached Larry O'Rourke's.
The sixth chapter of Ulysses, Hades, describes the funeral of Paddy Dignan at Glasnevin Cemetery. Mr. Bloom, who's intrigued by church rituals, listens to the funeral service with great interest. Then he joins the mourners in the procession to the grave. The men gossip and tell gruesome jokes.
The mourners moved away slowly, without aim, by devious paths, staying a while to read a name on a tomb. Let us go round by the chief's grave, Hines said. We have time. Let us, Mr. Power said. They turned to the right, following their slow thoughts. With awe, Mr. Power's blank voice spoke again. Some say he's not in the grave at all, that the coffin was filled with stones, that one day he will come again. Hines shook his head. Parnell will never come again, he said. He's there, all that was mortal of him. Peace to his ashes. Mr. Bloom walked unheeded along his grove by saddened angels, crosses, broken pillars, family vaults, stone hopes praying with upcast eyes, old Ireland's hearts and hands.
After the funeral, in the Aeolus chapter, Mr. Bloom is in the city centre at a newspaper office. Aeolus is a parody of newspapers and the journalistic style.
Before Nelson's pillar, trams slowed, shunted, changed trolley, started for Blackrock. The Horse Dublin United Tramway Company's timekeeper bawled them off. Rat can't turn your. Come on, Sandy Mount Green.
Mr. Bloom is in a newspaper office for his work. In this chapter, Joyce separates his text with newspaper headlines. These headlines range from the style of a Victorian newspaper to the catchpenny style of the modern press.
A typesetter brought a limp galley page. He began to check it silently. Want to be sure of his spelling. Proof fever. It is amusing to view the unpar 1 paralleled and barra 2 R's, is it? Double estimate of a harassed peddler while gauging all the symmetry of a peeled pear under a cemetery wall. Silly, isn't it? Cemetery put in, of course, on account of the symmetry.
In Ned Lambert's office are also Professor McHugh and Simon Dedalus, who were amused by a florid and pompous speech by Dan Dawson, which appeared in the morning papers.
Erin, green gem of the silver sea. Ned Lambert, seated on the table, read on. Or again, note the meanderings of some purling rill as it babbles on its way, fanned by gentle zephyrs, though quarrelling with the stony obstacles, to the tumbling waters of Neptune's blue domain, mid mossy banks, played on by the glorious sunlight, or neath the shadows cast o'er its pensive bosom by the overarching leafage of the giants of the forest. What about that, Simon? He asked over the fringe of his newspaper. How's that for high? How a great daily organ has turned out.
Stephen Dedalus arrives with the letter of Mr. Deasy, which provokes some hilarity.
He boomed that workaday worker tack for all it was worth. It's the ads and side features sell a weekly, not the stale news in the official gazette. Queen Anne is dead. Dear Mr. Editor, what is a good cure for flatulence? I'd like that part. Learn a lot teaching others. The personal note MAP, mainly all pictures.
The Dubliners in the editorial office have not much to do. They hang round and talk until Stephen invites them for a drink at Mooney's pub across O'Connell Street. Stephen and Professor McHugh leave first.
Dear dirty Dublin, Dubliners, 2 Dublin Vestals, Stephen said, elderly and pious, have lived 50 and 53 years in Funbally's Lane. Where is that? The professor asked. Off Black Pits. They want to see the views of Dublin from the top of Nelson's Pillar. They put on their bonnets and best clothes and take their umbrellas for fear it may come on to rain. They give 2 threepenny bits to the gentleman at the turnstile and begin to waddle slowly up the winding staircase, grunting, encouraging each other, afraid of the dark, panting, one asking the other, have you the brawn, praising God and the Blessed Virgin, threatening to come down, peeping at the air slits. Glory be to God, they had no idea it was that high. Antithesis, the professor said, nodding twice. Festal virgins. I can see them. What's keeping our friend? A bevy of scampering newsboys rushed down the steps, scampering in all directions. Hard out of them, Miles Crawford appeared on the steps, his hat aureoling his scarlet face, talking with J.J. O'Malloy. Interview with the editor. What will I tell him, Mr. Crawford? KMA. Will you tell him he can kiss my arse? Miles Crawford said, throwing out his arm for emphasis. Tell him that straight from the stable. While Mr. Bloom stood weighing the point and about to smile, he strode on jerkily. When they have eaten the brawn and the bread, they go nearer to the railings. They see the roofs and argue about where the different churches are. Rathmines Blue Dome, Adam and Eve's, St. Lawrence O'Toole's. But it makes them giddy to look up, so they pull up their skirts. Easy all, Miles Crawford said. No poetic license. J.J. O'Malloy sent a weary sidelong glance towards the statue and held his peace. I see, the professor said. He halted on Sir John Gray's pavement island and peered aloft at Nelson through the meshes of his wry smile.
In the 8th chapter, Lestrygonians, Mr. Bloom continues his wanderings through Dublin. A young man hands him a religious pamphlet, and he gets a shock when he thinks that the opening letters of the sentence "Blood of the Lamb" are that of his own name, Bloom.
Blue? Me? No. Blood of the Lamb. His slow feet walked him riverward, reading. Are you saved? All are washed in the blood of the Lamb. God wants blood victim.
Mr. Bloom throws the religious pamphlet into the Liffey.
Looking down, he saw flapping strongly, wheeling between the gaunt quay walls, gulls. Rough weather outside. If I threw myself down. He threw down among them a crumpled paper ball. The ball bobbed unheeded on the wake of swells, floated under by the bridge piers. Live by their wits. They wheeled, flapping. The hungry, famished gull flaps o'er the waters dull. Mr. Bloom moved forward, raising his troubled eyes. Think no more about that. Time ball on the ballast offices down. Done sink time.
Mr. Bloom crosses Westmoreland Street.
He walked along the curbstone. Stream of life. Oh, Mr. Bloom, how do you do? Oh, how do you do, Mrs. Breen? No use complaining. How is Molly these times? In the pink, Mr. Bloom said gaily. How are all your charges? All on the baker's list, Mrs. Breen said. You're in black, I see. You have no... No, Mr. Bloom said. I've just come from a funeral. He passed the Irish Times. He crossed under Tommy Moore's roguish finger. They did right to put him over a urinal. Meeting of the waters. Ought to be a place for women. Running into cake shops. Settle my hat straight. There is not in this wide world a valley. Great song of Julia Morgan's. Kept her voice up to the very last.
Mr. Bloom walks past Trinity College University.
City full passing away, other city full coming, passing away too. Other coming on, passing on. Houses, lines of houses, streets, changing hands. They buy the place up with gold and still they have all the gold. Swindling it somewhere.
Mr. Bloom goes to Davy Byrne's pub.
He entered Davy Byrne's. Moral pub. Stands a drink now and then. But in leap year, once in 4. Hello, Bloom, Nosy Flynn said from his nook. Hello, Flynn. How's things? Tip-top. Let me see. I'll take a glass of Burgundy and let me see. Wife well? Quite well, thanks. A cheese sandwich, then. Gorgonzola, have you? What is this he is? Isn't he in the insurance line? He's out of that long ago, Nosy Flynn said. He does canvassing for the Freeman. Mr. Bloom, on his way out, raised 3 fingers in greeting. So long, Nosy Flynn said. The others turned. Phew, Paddy Leonard said with scorn. Mr. Byrne, sir, we'll take 2 of your small Jamesons after that and a stone ginger, Davy Byrne added civilly. Mr. Bloom walked towards Dawson Street, his tongue brushing his teeth smooth.
The light lunch and the glass of Burgundy has a magical effect on Mr. Bloom.
A blind stripling stood tapping the curbstone with a slender cane. Do you want a cross? Mr. Bloom asked. Queer idea of Dublin he must have, tapping his way round by the stones. Could he walk in a beeline if he hadn't that cane? Look at all the things they can learn to do. Sense of smell must be stronger too. Smells on all sides bunched together. Each person too. Then the spring, the summer. Smells. Tastes. Mr. Bloom came to Kildare Street. First I must... library. To the right, museum, goddesses. Making for the museum gate with long, windy strides, he lifted his eyes. Handsome building, Sir Thomas Deane designed.
In the chapter Scylla et Charybdis, Stephen and Mulligan are at the National Library. With them are the poet A.E. George Russell, John Eglinton and the librarian Lister. Lister is speaking with enthusiasm about Goethe's picture of Hamlet.
And we have we not, those priceless pages of Wilhelm Meister, a great poet and a great brother poet. The beautiful, ineffectual dreamer who comes to grief against hard facts. One always feels that Goethe's judgments are so true. Our young Irish bards, John Eglinton censured, have yet to create a figure which the world will set beside Saxon Shakespeare's Hamlet, though I admire him, as Ben did, on this side of idolatry. All these questions are purely academic, Russell oracled out of his shadow. The supreme question about a work of art is out of how deep a life does it spring. The deepest poetry of Shelley, the words of Hamlet bring our mind into contact with the eternal wisdom, Plato's world of ideas. All the rest is the speculation of schoolboys for schoolboys.
Mr. Bloom arrives at the library in search of a copy of a Kilkenny paper. In the chapter Wandering Rocks, the Dubliners go about their business. All the most important characters in the novel are walking around Dublin. Mr. Bloom is in search of a romantic novel for his wife.
They went up the steps and under Merchant's Arch. A dark-backed figure scanned books. There he is, Lenihan said. Wonder what he's buying, McCoy said, glancing behind. Mr. Bloom turned over idly pages of The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, then of Aristotle's masterpiece.
In the chapter Nausicaa, as the evening draws in, Mr. Bloom walks along Sandymount Strand. He watches a young girl, Gertie MacDowell. Some children are playing nearby. In the chapter Ithaca, Mr. Bloom brings Stephen to his home at 7 Eccles Street. The two men have the impression that their chance meeting has a special significance. In fact, they represent father and son. Stephen refuses an invitation to stay at Bloom's home and goes on his way. Mr. Bloom joins Molly in bed. In the last chapter of Ulysses, Penelope, Molly Bloom lies in bed and is thinking over the day's happenings. Many different scenes from her past life also cross her mind. She thinks especially about her life with Leopold Bloom. Joyce lets Molly's thoughts run freely. There are no punctuation marks. The word yes is frequently used by Molly and is the last word in Ulysses. Molly is astonished that Bloom was asked to have his breakfast in bed the next day, and she thinks that he has been unfaithful.
Yes, because he never did a thing like that before, as asked to get his breakfast in bed with a couple of eggs since the City Arms Hotel, when he used to be pretending to be laid up with a sick voice, doing his highness to make himself interesting to that old faggot, Mrs. Riordan, telling me all her ailments she had. Too much chat in her about politics and earthquakes and the end of the world. Let us have a bit of fun first. God help the world if all the women were her sort. I hope I'll never be like her.
The church bell rings out. Molly's thoughts spread over a wide range of reflections and memories. Then she thinks about the first time she made love with Leopold Bloom.
Yes, I think he made them a bit firmer, sucking them like that so long. He made me thirsty. Titties, he called them. I had to laugh, yes. They're supposed to represent beauty placed up there like those statues in the museum. Of course, compared with what a man looks like, with his 2 bags full and his other thing hanging down out of him or sticking up at you like a hat rack. No wonder they hide it with a cabbage leaf. I love flowers. I'd love to have the whole place swimming in roses. God of heaven, there's nothing like nature. The wild mountains, then the sea and the waves rushing, then the beautiful country with fields of oats and wheat and all kinds of things, and all the fine cattle going about. That would do your heart good, to see rivers and lakes and flowers, all sorts of shapes and smells and colours springing up. Nature it is. As for them saying there's no God, I wouldn't give a snap of my 2 fingers for all their learning. Why don't they go and create something? I often asked him, atheists, or whatever they call themselves, go and wash the cobbles off themselves first. Then they go howling for the priest and they dying, and why? Why? Because they're afraid of hell, on account of their bad conscience. Ah, yes, I know them well. Who was the first person in the universe before there was anybody that made it all? Who? Ah, that they don't know. Neither do I. So there you are. They might as well try to stop the sun from rising tomorrow. The sun shines for you, he said. The day we were lying among the rhododendrons on Howth Head. The day I got him to propose to me, yes. First, I gave him the bit of seed cake out of my mouth. 16 years ago, my God. After that long kiss, I near lost my breath, yes. He said I was a flower of the mountain, yes. So we are flowers, all a woman's body, yes. That was one true thing he said in his life. And the sun shines for you today, yes. That was why I liked him, because I saw he understood or felt what a woman is. And I knew I could always get round him, and I gave him all the pleasure I could, leading him on till he asked me to say yes. Oh, that awful deep-down torrent. Oh, and the sea crimson sometimes like fire, and the glorious sunsets, and the jessamine and geraniums and cactuses, and Gibraltar as a girl, where I was a flower of the mountain, yes. When I put the rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used, or shall I wear a red? Yes. And how he kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And then he asked me, would I, yes, to say yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me, so he could feel my breasts all perfume, yes. And his heart was going like mad. And yes, I said, yes, I will, yes.
In Dublin's fair city, where the girls are so pretty, 'twas there that I first met sweet Molly Malone, as she wheeled her wheelbarrow through streets broad and narrow, crying cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh, our souls, alive, alive, oh.